Hello, friends. It's Jimmy here, welcoming you to this compilation of my most interesting financial crime mysteries I've covered during the last year. Before we start, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. Either that or just drop a quick "I'm doing my part" in the comments. Now, with that said, let's get down to business. It was like a scene out of a movie. A wealthy investor under investigation sneaks onto a private jet, whisking himself out of the country just ahead of the law. The fugitive vanishes into a string of tropical hideouts, taunting authorities who can never quite catch him. Decades later, rumors swirl that even his death might have been an elaborate hoax. This isn't fiction, but the real story of Robert Vesco. He's a man whose name became synonymous with high-stakes financial crime and one of the most perplexing disappearing acts in modern history. Vesco's saga is a cocktail of distilled greed, high-stakes intrigue, and pure audacity. In the 1970s, he was wanted for bilking investors out of around $200 million, making illegal political payoffs, and plotting schemes reaching the White House. Yet what makes Vesco's tale truly extraordinary is not just the scale of his misdeeds, but how he evaded justice by slipping through the cracks of international law. For nearly 40 years, law enforcement hunted him across the globe while he lived in luxury, courting presidents and dictators in search of safe haven. In the end, he disappeared so completely that even confirming his passing became a mystery. If you look at the start of Robert Lee Vesco's life, you could have never guessed that he was destined to be a criminal mastermind. Born in 1935, he was a high school dropout who first worked on Detroit's assembly lines before finding his way into finance. As a teen, he had vowed to escape Detroit, run his own company, and become a millionaire, ambitions he spectacularly achieved by his early 30s. By the age of 30, he had taken over a struggling machine tool company in New Jersey, turned it around, and renamed it International Controls Corporation. This meteoric rise made Vesco the young millionaire he had always dreamed of being, and if this is where it stopped, he may have been remembered as a successful business tycoon. But despite having pretty much whatever he wanted, his ambition soon veered into deeply unscrupulous territory. In 1970, he set his sights on a Geneva-based mutual fund empire called Investors Overseas Services, which was in deep trouble. Vesco swooped in and bought iOS for a mere $5 million, gaining control of an estimated $400 million of other people's money. The iOS accounting was so chaotic that, by adding a few subterfuges of his own, Vesco could plunder its holdings at will. Investigators later alleged that he hid the money via sham companies and even broke into a Swiss bank vault to seize shares. What followed was one of the largest financial scandals of the era. Once he had control, Vesco allegedly siphoned money out of the company through a maze of shell companies and deceptive bookkeeping. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission eventually charged that he stole more than $224 million from the iOS funds. These weren't funds owned by the company, to be clear. These were assets under management by the company itself. In essence, he had stolen other people's money on an extremely grand scale. By late 1972, the SEC filed a civil fraud suit against Vesco and his associates, accusing them of massive embezzlement. iOS soon collapsed, and investors eventually recovered only a fraction of their money. But by then, Vesco was long gone, and criminal charges loomed on the horizon. Facing imminent indictment, Vesco made a brazen move. In early 1973, rather than face justice, he fled the United States. According to later allegations, he loaded up his corporate jet with about $200 million of the looted assets, and took off to parts unknown. This dramatic escape marked the beginning of Robert Vesco's life as an international fugitive. Vesco's first stop was the Caribbean, a region that would serve as his sanctuary for years to come. He initially landed in the Bahamas and then settled in Costa Rica, which had no extradition treaty with the United States. In Costa Rica, Vesco lived lavishly and quickly moved to secure his safety. He courted President José Figueres by pouring money into local business ventures, reportedly investing millions into his adopted country's economy. His largesse paid off, and the Costa Rican legislature, influenced by the president, passed a law ensuring Vesco couldn't be extradited. José Figueres, facing criticism for harboring a fugitive, said Costa Rica would take money from anyone if it helped the country. With this legal shield in place, the fugitive financier openly enjoyed life in Costa Rica, while American prosecutors mauled helplessly on the sidelines. The audacity of Vesco's bribery didn't stop at small countries. Before fleeing the U.S., he had tried to use his wealth to halt the SEC investigation. Through a chain of intermediaries, he funneled a secret $200,000 contribution into President Richard Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. He had hoped the Nixon administration would quash the case against him and open him up to returning to the United States as a free man. That gambit failed, and two of Nixon's associates, John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, were indicted and later acquitted for obstructing justice in connection with the donation. Not content with meddling in one White House, Vesco later boasted of a scheme to bribe officials to lift sanctions on Libya. This event entangled President Jimmy Carter's brother in scandal. Still, from his tropical refuge, he showed how money could overcome ideology and borders. He befriended whoever could offer protection: democratically elected leaders, socialist revolutionaries, even narco kingpins. Simply put, he was cool with anyone who might help him stay out of American reach. Vesco's welcome in Costa Rica lasted until 1978. When Figueres left office and a new president took over, the government rescinded Vesco's special protections. Sensing the shift, Vesco slipped out of Costa Rica just before authorities could turn on him. Thus began an endless journey from one haven to the next. He resurfaced in the Bahamas, where he had cultivated ties to the Prime Minister and even Medellin cartel figures. He even tried to buy a small Caribbean island for himself at one point, but when that plan fell through, he kept up his itinerant lifestyle. Vesco traveled in style. At one point, he owned a private Boeing 707 jetliner outfitted with a bar and even a disco lounge. He spared no expense on mansions, yachts, and entertainment. But he knew that as a fugitive who hides in plain sight, he must constantly buy protection in each temporary refuge. Over the years, he burned through much of his stolen fortune doing just that. By the 1980s, his look had evolved from a boardroom executive to something out of Scarface. His slick suits gave way to sunglasses, open-collar shirts, and flashy sideburns. By the early 1980s, Vesco found refuge in Nicaragua, then governed by the Sandinistas. As with his prior hosts, he promised to invest and aid the economy, but no grand projects ever materialized, and he eventually moved on. In 1982, Cuba accepted Robert Vesco for humanitarian medical reasons, on the condition that he refrain from any financial mischief on their soil. Cuba had no extradition agreement with America, making it an ideal hideout, and for a time Vesco kept a low profile in Havana, living under the alias Tom Adams. Even Fidel Castro publicly said that Cuba didn't care about Vesco's past and wasn't interested in his money as long as he behaved. It was speculated at the time that Castro had simply let Vesco into Cuba for the sole reason of being a thorn in the side of the American authorities. It was, in essence, a small diplomatic and domestic propaganda win, hosting a man who was exiled from the United States. But for Vesco, old habits die hard, and despite Castro's conditions, he couldn't resist one more big scheme. In 1989, American prosecutors indicted him yet again, this time for smuggling, alleging that he had conspired with Medellin cartel traffickers. They alleged that he was working together with well-known Pablo Escobar associate and kingpin Carlos Lader to ship Colombian confetti into the States. Also, just as a quick aside, when researching this, I found out that as of 2025, Carlos Lader is a free man. I feel like I need to do a segment on him at some point in the future, but I digress. Safely entrenched in Cuba, Vesco shrugged off that American indictment, but a few years later he embarked on an even more bizarre venture that would ultimately be his undoing. In the early 1990s, he teamed up with a member of President Nixon's family and a rogue ex-CIA agent to promote a supposed miracle drug called TX. The pitch was straight out of a late-night infomercial. They claimed it could boost the immune system and eliminate literally any disease, and he was intent on selling this idea to the Cuban government. For a brief moment, Vesco reinvented himself as a biotech entrepreneur, even convincing Cuban authorities to let him conduct what I'll loosely call clinical trials. Reality caught up with Vesco in May 1995. The Cuban government discovered the wonder drug venture was a scam and promptly arrested Vesco. In 1996, he was convicted of fraud and illicit economic activities and sentenced to 13 years in a Cuban prison. The man who once hopped countries with impunity was now behind bars in the very nation that had given him his most permanent refuge. Vesco remained behind bars in Cuba for nearly a decade until he was finally released in 2005. In declining health and in his 70s, Vesco was quietly released to live out his final days under Cuban supervision. After decades of indulgence, he was a frail shadow of his former self, and for most people, this would be where the story ends. But for Vesco, one final twist in his saga was yet to come. The end of Robert Vesco's life is shrouded in uncertainty and rumor. According to multiple reports, Vesco died on November 23, 2007 in Havana at age 72, succumbing to lung cancer. In true Vesco fashion, news of his death was not announced by Cuban officials. It was only months later that journalists uncovered records of his burial and photographs suggesting his fate. A Havana cemetery log showed that a Robert Vesco was interred on that date, and images surfaced of an emaciated Vesco in a hospital bed and later in a coffin. These pointed to a quiet end for the fugitive financier. Yet many were not convinced, and his own former associates immediately suspected a hoax as Vesco had used disguises to escape in the past. Indeed, one of his closest confidants, a rogue CIA agent named Frank Turpil, flatly rejected the official story. Turpil claimed that his friend had slipped out of Cuba and was living secretly in Sierra Leone. According to this theory, the ailing old man in the photos was real, but the death was staged so Vesco could vanish under a new identity. And if anyone could manage that feat, it was definitely Vesco. Whether Robert Vesco truly perished in Cuba or slipped off the radar forever, his vanishing act stands as one of the most notorious in modern criminal history. He left behind a trail of ruined companies and lives. His journey, from working-class Detroit dropout to globe-trotting fugitive financier, is a story that's stranger than fiction. But that's not where the story ends, and Vesco's story gets even weirder, potentially at least. One of the most persistent theories about Robert Vesco's ability to elude capture for decades is that he may have been connected to American intelligence services. Critics point out that few fugitives managed to evade the combined pressure of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and other agencies for as long as Vesco did. This is especially true when his crimes involved hundreds of millions of dollars and the most powerful people in the world. Some argue that his reach into political circles, from Nixon's inner circle to involvement in shadowy dealings with Cuba and Libya, was no mere chance. They suggest he wasn't simply a rogue financier, but someone whose activities intersected with American covert interests. Supporters of this theory highlight Vesco's connections to figures with CIA backgrounds and his ability to operate freely in countries that were usually hostile to American fugitives. They speculate that Vesco may have acted as an asset, using his wealth and global contacts to open doors, pass along information, or grease diplomatic wheels. While no concrete evidence has ever surfaced proving such a relationship, it does explain how a working-class kid from Detroit could spend his entire life apparently evading the authorities. It was a crisp October evening in 2017 when Dr. Ruha Ignatova stepped off a flight from Sofia, Bulgaria to Athens and vanished without a trace. Until that moment, Ignatova was riding high as the glamorous self-styled crypto queen. She was the founder of a cryptocurrency empire called OneCoin that had attracted millions of investors worldwide. She lived a life of luxury and audacity, hosting flashy events, touting her PhD title, and promising financial revolution. But in the blink of an eye, she disappeared into thin air. What followed was an international manhunt and a mystery that continues to this day. Ruha Ignatova was a Bulgarian-born, German-educated businesswoman who became infamous as the face of OneCoin, a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme she co-founded in 2014. Highly intelligent and charismatic, she held a PhD in law and even worked at a respected consulting firm, which lent her credibility. By her mid-30s, Ignatova styled herself as a visionary fintech entrepreneur. She often wore expensive designer dresses and bold red lipstick, exuding confidence as her followers proclaimed her the queen of a financial revolution. Under her leadership, OneCoin grew into a multi-billion-dollar operation in just a few years, with a global network of investors entranced by her slick presentations and lofty promises. Ruha's rise to notoriety didn't come from nowhere. She was born in 1980 in Bulgaria and moved to Germany as a child, excelling in school and later obtaining a doctorate in international law. Despite a seemingly respectable start, including a stint at McKinsey & Company, she showed early signs of deception. In 2012, Ignatova was convicted in Germany of fraud for orchestrating a dubious corporate bankruptcy scheme and given a suspended 14-month prison sentence. By 2013, she was already involved in another sketchy crypto venture called Bitcoin, a multi-level marketing scheme that ultimately collapsed. These experiences paved the way for OneCoin, which Ignatova launched in 2014 with grand ambitions and an appetite for fraud on a far larger scale. Also, just as a quick aside, had she simply bought and held Bitcoin back in 2013, she'd be a billionaire today instead of on the FBI's most wanted list, but I digress. Once OneCoin was underway, Ignatova's personal brand soared. She embraced public appearances, draped in luxury, and spoke with polished confidence about how her cryptocurrency would change the world. Attendees of OneCoin events recall the electric atmosphere she created. Few suspected that behind the scenes, she and her co-founders derisively referred to OneCoin as what I'll euphemistically call a poop coin, and knew it was all a sham. Behind the dazzling conferences and confident proclamations, OneCoin wasn't what it seemed. Ignatova's company marketed itself as a cryptocurrency similar to Bitcoin, but in reality, OneCoin had no actual blockchain. This means the coins and their supposed ever-increasing value were entirely fictitious. The business model was essentially a classic pyramid scheme. Investors bought educational packages and OneCoin tokens and earned commissions by recruiting members. Between 2014 and 2016 alone, over 3 million people invested in these cryptocurrency packages, generating more than $5 billion in revenue for OneCoin. Victims around the world emptied their life savings based on promises of huge returns. In truth, the value of OneCoin was simply made up by the founders and displayed on a fake internal exchange. There was no open market or transparent ledger backing it. While early investors saw their account balances soar on paper, they ultimately found they couldn't cash out in any meaningful way due to so-called lock-in periods. By 2016, financial regulators and journalists worldwide had started questioning OneCoin's legitimacy. Authorities in several countries issued warnings, and cracks began to appear in the company's facade. Nonetheless, Ignatova continued to expand her empire, opening offices and staging recruitment rallies from Europe to Asia. By late 2017, the walls were closing in on Ignatova. Unbeknownst to the OneCoin founder, U.S. investigators had flipped one of her insiders, her American boyfriend, Gilbert Armenta, into an informant. In fact, on October 12, 2017, Ignatova was secretly indicted in New York on fraud and money laundering charges. Sensing that her time was almost up, she hatched a dramatic escape plan. On October 25, 2017, Ruha Ignatova was scheduled to speak to an audience of OneCoin investors at a conference in Lisbon, Portugal, but she never showed up. Instead, that day she boarded a Ryanair flight from Bulgaria to Greece, and upon landing in Athens, she disappeared without a trace. According to later testimony, Ignatova's personal bodyguards reported that when the plane landed, she was met by a pair of mysterious Russian men. She was whisked away before even entering the airport terminal. She was 37 years old when she disappeared and hasn't been seen since. What makes Ignatova's vanishing act especially intriguing is how thoroughly she managed to slip away. In an act of extreme selfishness, she even left behind her young daughter and has had no contact with her ever since. In the days and weeks after October 25th, 2017, rumors swirled about her fate and whereabouts. Some said she had fled to the Middle East. Others whispered that she was hiding in her native Bulgaria under an assumed identity. For a while, OneCoin continued operating under other leaders, including her younger brother Konstantin Ignatov, but the crypto queen herself was gone. Ignatova's disappearance prompted a worldwide effort to track her down. In her absence, authorities began dismantling the OneCoin operation and bringing its participants to justice. Her brother Konstantin Ignatov, who had taken on a public leadership role after Ruha vanished, was arrested in 2019 and later pleaded guilty to fraud and money laundering. In June 2022, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation added Ruha Ignatova to its 10 most wanted fugitives list, making her only the 11th woman ever to appear on that notorious roster, and the first to be accused of a multi-billion-dollar fraud. Investigators pursued leads across the globe. It emerged that after Athens, Ignatova might have traveled onward on a German passport, possibly to the United Arab Emirates, Russia, or elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Over time, several theories have emerged to explain what might have become of Ruha Ignatova. One possibility is that she is alive and in hiding, having used her immense wealth and connections to buy protection. Ignatova was known to have cultivated relationships with powerful underworld figures during her OneCoin days. An American investigator revealed that a notorious Bulgarian crime boss was closely involved in OneCoin's operations and even oversaw Ignatova's personal security. According to this account, Ignatova paid him around 100,000 euros per month for protection. and it was his network that helped whisk her out of Bulgaria in 2017. If true, this indicates she had arranged safe passage with the help of organized crime allies. Supporters of the still alive theory point to evidence that Ignatova may have quietly continued managing her assets even while on the run. In early 2023, for example, an investigative journalist discovered property documents in London that provided a tantalizing clue. A luxury penthouse apartment in Kensington, valued at over £11 million, had been purchased via an offshore company. Due to new transparency laws, Ignatova's name was recently revealed as the company's beneficial owner. It also implies she might be hiding in plain sight, under an alias, perhaps living in a haven in the Middle East or Russia, beyond the reach of extradition. Given her language skills and enormous resources, she could conceivably remain underground indefinitely, especially if she truly has changed her physical appearance. Yet an equally compelling theory holds that Ruha Ignatova met a darker fate. In 2022, a bombshell investigative report from Bulgaria claimed that Ignatova was slain on a crime lord's order not long after she vanished. According to a leaked Bulgarian police dossier, her body was chopped up and dumped from a yacht in the Ionian Sea near Greece. The story goes that once Ignatova became a liability, her bodyguards decided to eliminate her. Bulgarian records indicate that many of Ignatova's properties have since been taken over by people connected to this criminal. However, no hard proof of her passing has ever surfaced, and it's possible that these are steps taken to evade capture. Under this theory, this is all an elaborate smokescreen to provide cover for the fact that she's still very much alive. As of today, the fate of Ruha Ignatova remains one of the 21st century's great unsolved financial crime mysteries, and it continues to baffle investigators. At 9:30 on the morning of August 1st, 2012, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange signaled the start of a normal trading day. But for Knight Capital, it was the start of a nightmare, so to speak. Knight was one of Wall Street's top market makers, handling roughly 17% of all American stock trading volume at the time. But first, let me take a moment to do a quick aside on what a market maker is and why they accounted for such a large portion of volume. A market maker is a company, or technically even a person, that's always ready to buy and sell a stock so other people can trade quickly. They make money from the small difference between the price they buy at and the price they sell at, while keeping the market moving smoothly. Market makers profit by buying a stock at a slightly lower price and then selling it at a slightly higher price, pocketing the difference called the spread. Because they trade absolutely huge volumes of shares every day, even tiny spreads add up to big profits over the course of a year. Further, because they conduct so many trades so rapidly, they rely on algorithms to conduct these transactions. With that said, let's get down to how this incident occurred. On that fateful Wednesday morning, Knight Capital's systems went on a buying spree. The firm's algorithms unexpectedly started flooding the market with orders across a broad range of stocks. In the span of roughly half an hour, Knight accumulated positions in 154 different stocks, totaling about 397 million shares. The automated programs didn't just buy, they bought and sold repeatedly at rapid-fire speeds, ignoring normal trading limits. Stocks that Knight normally helped make markets in were suddenly whipsawing in price due to the sheer volume of erroneous trades. By the time Knight's team realized the extent of the problem, the company had unintentionally acquired around $7 billion worth of securities. These positions were unplanned, a massive inventory of overpriced stocks that no one at Knight actually intended to buy. The firm was now stuck holding huge long positions in some stocks and short positions in others, all accumulated by accident. As the losses mounted with each unintended trade, Knight's management scrambled to contain the damage. It took 45 frantic minutes before Knight Capital finally hit the switch and shut down its trading to stop the bleeding, but by then, the damage was done. The firm's unplanned stock positions had to be unwound as quickly as possible to avoid even greater losses. Knight frantically sold off the trove of stocks it never meant to own. This was a task so large that Goldman Sachs stepped in to buy the entire pile of unwanted shares by the end of the day, but at a massive discount. Unloading that inventory came at a high price, and Knight ultimately lost around $440 million when the dust settled. In mere minutes, a glitch had pushed a powerhouse trading firm to the brink of bankruptcy. The story behind Knight's glitch turned out to be a perfect storm of lack of oversight, poor management, rushed changes, and failed safety checks. Investigators and insiders pieced together the chain of events that led to the disaster. A retired trading feature called PowerPeg had been dormant in Knight's software since 2001, but its code was never fully removed. And yeah, there's more than a little bit of humor in the name of that trading feature in my view. In 2012, Knight repurposed the old features of the algorithm, unknowingly reactivating some of the PowerPeg logic in unintentional ways. I suppose you could even say that the algorithm appears to have been unintentionally set to pegging Knight Capital, but I'll come back to intentionality in a moment. Knight's team rolled out the new software, but one of its servers failed to update and continued running the obsolete code. This out-of-sync server was a ticking time bomb within the system. When the market opened, the rogue server started generating massive erroneous orders based on the old logic. Transactions multiplied uncontrollably. Millions of shares were bought and sold within minutes, since the usual volume caps and fail-safes had been bypassed. The immediate aftermath of the Knight Capital glitch was as chaotic as the event itself. News of the incident spread fast, and Knight's stock price plunged by nearly 50% in a single day. On the verge of collapse, Knight was forced to seek an emergency lifeline. Just days later, a group of firms poured about $400 million into Knight to stabilize it, since the removal of this firm from the playing board would decrease market liquidity big time. This rescue kept Knight Capital afloat, but at a steep cost. The new investors took a majority ownership stake at a fire sale price, diluting existing shareholders. Knight had essentially saved itself by selling itself off in pieces. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation and later fined Knight Capital $12 million for failing to have adequate risk controls. According to the SEC, Knight violated the market access rule, which requires brokers to have safeguards to prevent these kinds of trading disasters. The SEC's report made it clear that Knight's systems lacked the basic checks that could have stopped the avalanche of bad trades. For Knight Capital itself, there was no returning to business as usual. The firm limped on for only a few months with its reputation and capital badly damaged before it was fully taken over by one of the firms that had come to the rescue. Whenever a disaster of this scale happens, people naturally wonder if there is more to the story. Knight's 2012 glitch was officially attributed to a series of mistakes and bad luck, a perfect storm of human error. But in the aftermath, some observers floated theories that the event might not have been entirely accidental. Some have speculated that the error in the code was intentionally placed there, perhaps by a competitor, in a cloak-and-dagger act of sabotage. Others have speculated that the error may have been inserted by a disgruntled employee or contractor to bring down this massive firm. More outlandish theories even suggest that the firm was taken out by a state actor, though the reasoning for this is unclear. These theories have essentially gained significant traction because they're interesting. However, the intentional glitch theory remains firmly in the realm of speculation. Most experts agree that Knight's own internal errors lit the fuse, and once the bomb went off, natural market forces did the rest. In essence, the real mystery is why there were no meaningful safeguards to prevent this event, a question which will likely never be answered. On a January morning in 1984, two unknown men walked into Jack Brown's real estate office in Ypsilanti, a suburb of Detroit, and carried out a brazen execution in broad daylight. They ignored the receptionist and went straight for 47-year-old Jack Brown. One intruder shot Jack at point-blank range while the other stood guard, leaving his three co-workers unharmed. The perpetrators took nothing, confirming it definitely wasn't a robbery. To this day, the identity of the attackers and their motive remain a chilling mystery. Jack Brown was a 47-year-old real estate broker and lifelong Ypsilanti resident. He owned a small realty and insurance firm and was active in the local Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club. Jack was a married father of two and had no known ties to crime or any enemies. He was well known around town, and none of his friends or colleagues could imagine why anyone would want to harm him. This made his violent slaying all the more bewildering. On Wednesday, January 11th, 1984, around 11:10 that morning, two men entered Jack's office suite in Ypsilanti. Without a word, one headed straight into Jack's private office, while the other herded the three employees into a bathroom. Jack was on a phone call at that moment, reportedly talking to his son in the hospital, and he managed to say something along the line of, "There's trouble here," before the line went dead. The attackers immediately fled after locking the staff in the restroom, harming no one else. Jack's colleagues called 911, but by the time help arrived, he was unconscious. He died early the next morning at the hospital despite emergency surgery. At first, police wondered if a traditional robbery was the motive, but a safe in Jack's office was found open, with no money missing, so that theory was quickly dismissed. The police couldn't determine if the attackers opened the safe or if it was incidentally open at the time of the attack. But keep this in mind because I'm going to come back to this in a second, since that safe may have stored something more valuable than cash. Witnesses gave descriptions of the assailants, and police sketches showed one about 6 feet tall in a beige jacket, and the other around 5 feet 10 inches in blue coveralls and a knit cap. The men appeared to know the office layout, suggesting the attack was planned in advance. Despite these clues, the perpetrators have never been identified. Detectives dug through Jack's background for a motive but found none. He had no criminal record, no significant or unusual debts, and no history of shady dealings. Brown wasn't known to engage in any criminal lifestyle, leaving investigators baffled as to why he would be targeted. They even considered whether he led a secret double life, but uncovered no evidence of any hidden activities. Still, a few intriguing hints emerged. Jack's brother Norm said that on the night before the attack, he saw Jack having an intense, angry phone conversation at the office. When it ended, Jack claimed it was nothing serious and wouldn't elaborate. Norm later suspected that call was connected to the crime, though he had no solid proof of this other than the timing. Jack's wife Anne also recalled an eerie incident. A few weeks before the slaying, Jack had mentioned making a list of, quote, powerful people involved in illegal acts and hiding it in a safe deposit box. Anne brushed it off at the time, and Jack never brought it up again. And yeah, I think we all know that powerful people don't have a problem with a little bit of violence to conceal the lists that they may or may not be on. After his death, she searched for any such list or key but found nothing. This bizarre memory made investigators wonder if Jack knew dangerous secrets about influential individuals that gave someone a motive to silence him. Another notable coincidence was that on the day Jack was slain, the local police carried out a major raid on some higher-level street pharmacists, spurred by an anonymous tip. This led to speculation that Jack could have been that tipster, or otherwise had knowledge of the operation, and that his slaying was an act of retaliation. No proof linked Jack to the case, but the timing was hard to ignore. The leading theory is that Jack was slain on orders of powerful criminals he had crossed. Perhaps he had information about local traffickers or corrupt officials on a list stored in his safe. The cold, calculating manner in which the attack was carried out suggests the motive wasn't personal. However, the duo allowed their faces to be seen by a number of witnesses, suggesting that these guys might not have been in the big leagues, so to speak. Another theory is that Jack was secretly involved in something illicit, and it backfired on him. If he had a hidden criminal venture or unsavory associates, one of them might have decided to eliminate him when a deal went bad. However, investigators found no evidence of any secret life or illegal activity by Jack. One more speculative theory that is truly both disturbing and chilling turns on Jack Brown's very common name. This theory suggests that Jack could have been slain precisely due to his common name. It suggests that another Jack Brown perhaps owed a very large amount of money to an organized crime syndicate. Rather than eliminating the second Jack Brown and therefore not being repaid, they may have told him to get a newspaper from Michigan on January 12, 1984, no reason given. Under this theory, the second Jack Brown would have seen that a man with the exact same name was slain on the day after they told him to get a paper from Michigan. This would have perhaps sparked extreme fear in the target, forcing him to liquidate all his assets and pay back the organization very rapidly. It's entirely speculative and sounds like something more out of a movie, but it is a possibility. More than 40 years on, the question of why this attack happened to Jack Brown remains a haunting, unsolved mystery. It's a stark reminder that even an ordinary man with no known enemies can become the target of an extraordinary crime for apparently no reason. Until new evidence comes to light or someone talks, Jack's case will remain cold, but definitely not forgotten. The story of Gerald Cotton's demise sounds like something out of a movie. One day he was the youthful CEO of Canada's biggest cryptocurrency exchange, and the next he was reportedly dead overseas, taking to the grave all the secret keys to a digital fortune. For tens of thousands of investors, that nightmare scenario became reality. His sudden death left $169 million in cryptocurrency and cash inaccessible, and customers were in shock. As the case unfolded, it became clear that this may not have been the tragic end to a visionary entrepreneur's life, but rather a story of deceit, fraud, and voluntary disappearance. Gerald Cotton was a Canadian cryptocurrency entrepreneur known as the co-founder and CEO of Quadriga CX, which was at one point the country's dominant Bitcoin exchange. Born in 1988, Cotton grew up in Ontario and graduated from York University's business program, where he developed an early interest in digital currencies. In 2013, he teamed up with an associate, Michael Patron, to launch Quadriga, a cryptocurrency exchange platform. Cotton became the public face of the company, projecting an image of a friendly, tech-savvy innovator on a mission to make crypto accessible to Canadians. He marketed himself as a friendly blockchain wizard with a genial demeanor. He was also active in the community, serving as a director of the Vancouver Bitcoin Co-op and hosting local Bitcoin meetups to champion the new technology. The crypto boom of that period made Cotton very wealthy. He acquired luxury items like a sailboat, multiple high-end properties, an airplane, and even a private island. After its founding, Quadriga quickly grew to become a major player in Canada's cryptocurrency market. At its height, the platform boasted around 350,000 users, and saw about $1.2 billion worth of Bitcoin traded in 2017 alone. To put this in perspective, Bitcoin was only a few years removed from being traded on a Magic the Gathering online exchange by that point. Or should I say, something that originally started out that way at the very least. Cotton ran the business largely from his encrypted laptop, and by 2016 was essentially running it single-handedly, with no other full-time employees or directors involved. On the surface, Quadriga appeared to be thriving. However, behind the scenes, it lacked proper financial controls and had growing liquidity problems. For instance, a Canadian bank once froze about 25 million of Quadriga's funds in 2018 due to uncertainty over who really owned the money. Still, users remained largely unaware of any issues and continued to entrust their money to Quadriga right up until after Cotton's fateful trip in late 2018. In December 2018, Cotton traveled to Jaipur in South Asia with his new wife, Jennifer Robertson, for a honeymoon that doubled as a charitable visit. The couple planned to visit an orphanage and donate supplies to children. Super charitable of them. And yeah, even through my deadpan delivery, I'm hoping you could detect the sarcasm in my voice, because things are about to go seriously off the rails. Just days into the trip, Cotton fell ill with sudden stomach pain and was admitted to a local hospital on December 8, 2018. He was diagnosed with acute gastroenteritis that rapidly escalated to septic shock. Within roughly 24 hours, on December 9th, the 30-year-old went into cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead. The official story was that Cotton died from complications of Crohn's disease. The gastroenterologist who treated him later said he wasn't entirely sure about the diagnosis and was haunted by how quickly Cotton's condition spiraled out of control. Cotton's body was quickly embalmed and flown back to Canada, and a local death certificate was issued. No autopsy was conducted, and stranger still, Quadriga didn't immediately inform its customers of Cotton's passing. It was only on January 14, 2019, more than a month later, that the company announced Gerald Cotton had died from Crohn's complications in a foreign land. As soon as Cotton's death was disclosed, panic set in among Quadriga's users. It turned out that Cotton was the only person with the passwords and recovery keys for Quadriga's funds, and now those digital wallets were inaccessible without him. Roughly 169 million Canadian dollars worth of Bitcoin and other assets were effectively frozen on the platform, affecting around 75,000 customers. The exchange soon halted operations and filed for creditor protection by the end of January 2019. In fact, during the weeks before the death was made public, Quadriga's website still accepted deposits. This was suspicious because withdrawals had quietly stopped because the only person who could execute them was already dead. This infuriated customers and further deepened the mystery. For many, this was more than just an online drama. It was a personal financial catastrophe, as some lost their retirement savings or children's college funds in the freeze. It didn't take long for doubts and conspiracy theories to swirl. Cryptocurrency observers were baffled that a CEO like Cotton had no contingency plan for access to the exchange's assets. Even those who knew him were astonished. One blockchain security expert noted that Cotton understood the need for backups and would never leave everything to chance, making the lack of any plan B extremely hard to fathom. However, what would come out later would explain why old Jerry didn't take these basic security precautions. But hang tight, because I'll come to that in a moment. The circumstances of his death abroad also raised extreme suspicion. Cotton had signed a will just days before his trip, leaving his $10 million estate to his wife, and even setting aside $100,000 for his two dogs. Yet that document curiously made absolutely no mention of any passwords or crypto wallets for Quadriga's funds. Of course, creating the will just before the trip was also a suspicious act as well, though initially it was explained away by his new marriage. In addition, his death-related paperwork from overseas had peculiarities. His name was misspelled on the death certificate, and the hospital executive who signed his documents had a prior fraud conviction. On Reddit and Twitter, some aggrieved users openly speculated that Cotton might have faked his death and vanished with the money. Authorities and the crypto community alike set out to investigate. Initially, many assumed Quadriga's predicament was just a worst-case scenario of poor succession planning, essentially a one-man business where the keys died with the king. However, as inquiries proceeded, a far more sinister reality began to emerge. In early 2019, Canadian courts declared Quadriga bankrupt and appointed Forensic Accounts as an independent monitor to trace any remaining assets. Law enforcement agencies also opened probes. Meanwhile, armchair detectives scoured the blockchain, the public ledger of transactions, to follow the trail of Quadriga's holdings. They discovered something alarming. Some of Quadriga's so-called cold wallets, offline reserves, were empty, and large sums had been moved out months before Cotton's trip. In other words, much of the money was already missing, rather than simply locked away waiting for a password. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the story became. Journalists uncovered that Cotton's co-founder, Michael Patron, was actually a convicted fraudster who had changed his name from Omar Danani after serving time in the States. Cotton's own past was also scrutinized, revealing that he had dabbled in dubious online investment schemes as a younger man. By late 2019, with still no recovery of the missing cryptocurrency, lawyers for Quadriga's users even asked authorities to exhume Cotton's corpse. In June 2020, a report by the Ontario Securities Commission finally provided definitive answers. The OSC concluded that Quadriga collapsed because of fraud committed by Gerald Cotton. Essentially, Cotton had turned Quadriga into a Ponzi scheme in its final years. He secretly siphoned off client assets for personal use and made reckless trades with customer funds. When his bets went wrong or cryptocurrency prices fell, he covered the losses using new deposits from other users. By the time of his death, the exchange owed about $215 million to its users, but the money was largely gone. Cotton had also drained approximately $24 million for personal expenses and lost about $115 million through bad trades and mismanagement of user assets. Only a small fraction of the funds was ever recovered. Roughly $34 million was eventually found and paid back to customers. Cotton's widow denied any knowledge of the scam and ended up voluntarily turning over all the money she had received from his estate. In the end, Quadriga was a case of deceit and financial wrongdoing hidden behind the hype of a crypto platform. Cotton's body was never exhumed, and it remains unclear if this cryptocurrency fraudster remains out there somewhere in the world or not. Personally, I think the entire thing sounds a little bit too convenient to be taken at face value. John Cheek, born on August 3, 1965, was a promising financial executive working in Memphis, Tennessee. He earned a bachelor's degree from Southern Methodist University and an MBA from the University of Chicago. By age 28, he had become the chief financial officer of the Cates Company, a prominent real estate firm in Memphis. He Company was on the verge of going public, a move that would have significantly increased Cheek's financial standing, potentially elevating his salary and granting him $2 million in stock options. As of 2025, this would be just shy of $5 million. Not a bad payday at all. In late 1993, Cheek was deeply involved in the company's transition to a public real estate investment trust. This period was marked by intense work, with Cheek reportedly working 18-hour days and traveling extensively to cities like Milwaukee, Portland, and Denver to meet with investors. The process faced unexpected delays due to questions from the Securities and Exchange Commission, adding to the pressure he was under. Despite these challenges, the deal was eventually completed, and an audit found no evidence of wrongdoing on Cheek's part. However, by then, Cheek had disappeared and never received the financial rewards he had anticipated. On the evening of December 2nd, 1993, after returning from a business trip, Cheek had dinner with a business associate at the Cooker restaurant in Memphis. He was reportedly drinking heavily during the dinner. Around 11 p.m., his associate dropped him off at the Crescent Center, where his vehicle was parked. This was the last confirmed sighting of Cheek, though I say confirmed here because things are about to get weird in a moment. The following morning, when Cheek failed to appear at work, his parents filed a missing persons report. Investigations revealed that his suitcases were unpacked at his new home in East Memphis, and towels his mother had placed on his bed had been moved, indicating he had been there. Notably, the garage door was also found open, and it's not clear from the evidence how long it had been left that way. Later that morning, his car was discovered abandoned near the Memphis, Arkansas bridge, which spans the Mississippi River. There were no signs of a struggle or any indication of his whereabouts. Authorities initially considered the possibility of self-deletion, speculating that Cheek might have jumped into the Mississippi River. However, extensive searches yielded no evidence to support this theory. Friends and family dismissed the idea, describing Cheek as an extremely driven and successful individual who was just on the verge of achieving a major life goal. In the months following his disappearance, there were several reported sightings of a man matching Cheek's description in various locations, including in Virginia and Arkansas. One notable sighting occurred in February 1994 at a truck stop in Raphine, Virginia, where a trucker believed he had interacted with Cheek. This trucker described the man as appearing to be disoriented and unaware of his identity. Notably, this wasn't just a quick passing sighting by the trucker. The trucker, being a good Samaritan and seeing a guy down on his luck, decided to buy the man breakfast and eat together with him. The man told the trucker that he was previously staying at a homeless shelter in Arkansas. Some speculated that Cheek might have been experiencing a dissociative fugue state, a rare condition triggered by extreme stress, leading to amnesia and unplanned travel. However, none of these sightings were conclusively verified. Despite extensive investigations, Cheek's whereabouts remain unknown, and in August 2000, he was legally declared dead. The Cates Company proceeded with its plans and went public in early 1994 as Mid-America Apartment Communities, Inc., a real estate investment trust. As of today, the company still trades on the New York Stock Exchange and has a market cap of just under $20 billion. Given the unusual nature of his disappearance, a number of theories have been talked about online. Some observers point to the high-pressure environment Cheek was under, working 18-hour days and traveling extensively, as a potential catalyst for him to walk away. By late 1993, the pending transition of the Cates Company into a public real estate investment trust may have brought extraordinary stress. It's theorized that he might have abandoned his old identity and begun anew under the radar, possibly motivated by a desire to escape the responsibilities and intensity of the corporate world. Proponents of this theory note that starting over could have offered him a clean slate, free from the obligations he found overwhelming. Still, there is no concrete evidence that Cheek planned or arranged for a deliberate disappearance, leaving this theory rooted in speculation rather than fact. Another theory is that Cheek somehow became entangled with criminal elements, whether through business dealings, financial disputes, or inadvertently. In this scenario, Cheek might have witnessed something, or owed a debt he couldn't repay, and was forcibly disappeared. However, law enforcement found no direct clues hinting at foul play in his car or his home, and investigators never confirmed any such criminal connections. I was able to find some very speculative theories online about two of his frat brothers disappearing under unusual circumstances during the same time period. That said, I wasn't able to find anything to corroborate this. A third explanation is that Cheek experienced a dissociative fugue, a rare psychiatric condition triggered by extreme stress, causing permanent amnesia. The period when he was working upwards of 18 hours a day, coupled with SEC delays and the looming IPO, could have created an immense psychological burden. The reported sightings of a man who resembled Cheek in Arkansas and Virginia, particularly the truck driver's account of a disoriented individual, lend some weight to this possibility. Still, no one definitively verified these sightings as Cheek, and over time, the trail went cold. If he were suffering from a prolonged fugue state, he could theoretically still be alive with little to no memory of his previous life. Also, quick note as I'm just editing and finalizing this now, and I realize I didn't mention the truck driver's name, which seems like a pretty big oversight given his good deed. Anyway, big shout out to Ron Jackson doing a kind act for an individual who was clearly in trouble, and sitting down with him and hearing him out when most people would have just ignored him. His daughter appears to have posted about the incident in February 2024, and she confirmed that he's still alive and thinks about what happened to Cheek till this day. So if you're listening and your dad is interested in talking more about this case, please reach out. It would be very interesting to actually conduct an interview with a primary source for one of the cases discussed in this series. The show jumping horse elimination scandal, spanning from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, stands as one of the most egregious episodes in sporting history that basically no one has heard of. During this period, numerous high-value show-jumping horses were deliberately slain to fraudulently collect insurance payouts. The exact number of horses put out to pasture remains uncertain, but estimates suggest it could be as high as 100. The motivations behind these slayings varied from case to case. Some owners facing financial difficulties saw insurance fraud as a quick solution. Others, having invested in overvalued or underperforming horses, chose to eliminate these animals to recoup their losses through insurance claims. In some instances, con men would trick wealthy individuals into purchasing overvalued horses. When the deception risked exposure, the horses were knocked off. A central figure in this scandal was Tommy the Sandman Burns. He earned his nickname because his specialty was putting innocent horses to sleep, if you know what I mean. Burns traveled the circuit with equipment designed to electrocute horses, a method he believed was quick and painless. Just kidding. He believed this method would be undetectable by insurance companies. For fees ranging from $5,000 to $40,000, he destroyed horses on behalf of their owners, who would then file fraudulent insurance claims. Burns's operations were extensive. At one point, evidence suggests he was electrocuting up to 3 horses a week. Burns ended up taking a plea deal, and over the course of the 90s, 35 people were convicted for this disturbing fraud. But where's the mystery, then, you may ask? Well, the most obvious mystery is that we don't really know the full extent of this fraud and how many people were involved. Notably, a lot of very wealthy and influential people were involved. And as tends to happen in these sorts of cases, we don't ever seem to get the full story. It kind of reminds me of a famous individual who definitely deleted himself fully voluntarily on August 10th, 2019, and whose client list has never been fully released. But there's also a human elimination associated with this case as well. One of the horse scammers attempted to negotiate a fraudulent horse transaction with Helen Brack, a wealthy heiress, in 1977. When she realized the whole transaction was a dog and pony show with sinister underpinnings, she told one of the scammers she would be reaching out to the district attorney. After leaving a medical appointment and while on her way to meet with someone from the DA's office, she disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. On a hot May day in 1990, a luxury car was found engulfed in flames in the Arizona desert, and its owner, a bank fraud investigator named Lee Young, had vanished without a trace. The burning plum-colored Lincoln Town car, discovered 100 miles south of Phoenix, yielded few clues. What it left behind was an enduring mystery that sounds like a movie, complete with missing jewels, cryptic phone calls, and whispers of a Colombian cartel. More than 3 decades later, the disappearance of Leroy Young remains unsolved. Lee Young was a 56-year-old bank executive and fraud investigator living in Scottsdale, Arizona. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, married to his wife, Connie, and a respected professional. In addition to his banking career, Lee had a side passion as a jeweler. He often bought and sold jewelry in his spare time, and was known to carry plenty of cash for those deals. He even wore a distinctive copper-faced Rolex watch encrusted with diamonds, a personal trademark that would later become a key detail in his case. As a fraud investigator, Lee's job was to delve into financial irregularities. In early 1990, he was working on a sensitive case. He suspected that his Scottsdale bank was being used by criminals to launder money, potentially involving a Colombian cartel. Lee had reached out to federal authorities about these suspicions, determined to uncover the truth behind the illicit funds flowing through the bank. On May 4, 1990, Lee Young went about his day as usual until lunchtime, when he met with a colleague at Coco's restaurant on North Scottsdale Road. He was last seen leaving the restaurant around 12:30 p.m., presumably heading back to work or to run errands. However, Lee never returned home that evening. At some point that afternoon, something mysterious happened, and Lee was never seen again. That day, after 3 p.m., a series of phone calls were made from Lee's car phone under puzzling circumstances. Records show that 1 incoming call was received, and 3 outgoing calls were dialed from the car phone later that afternoon. One of the numbers called was a payphone, and 2 others were to a woman who, when contacted, insisted she had never spoken with Lee that day. This raised the alarming possibility that these calls were made by someone other than Lee. Detectives noted that it's entirely possible Lee was already in danger by early afternoon, and that any calls made after about 2 p.m. might have been placed by the perpetrator. In other words, the very person responsible for Lee's disappearance could have been using his car phone, possibly to misdirect investigators. Friends and family grew concerned when Lee didn't come home on May 4th, and by the next morning, their worst fears were realized. On May 5th, 1990, the day after Lee disappeared, a deputy sheriff in Pinal County came upon a shocking sight in the remote desert near Oracle, Arizona. It was a Lincoln Town car blazing on the side of a dirt road. By the time authorities extinguished the flames, the car was burned to its frame. It was soon identified as Lee Young's car, though there was no sign of Lee himself at the scene. Due to the extensive fire damage, any potential forensic evidence was completely destroyed. The location of the burning car, about 100 miles south of Phoenix in a sparsely traveled area, deepened the mystery. When investigators combed through the wreckage of Lee's 1989 town car, they made a perplexing discovery. In the trunk of the car, remarkably intact despite the fire, they found a cache of jewelry valued at several $1,000s. This was inventory that Lee likely carried for his side business in jewelry trading. Notably, however, a couple of critical items were missing. Lee's cherished Rolex watch, the one he always wore, was gone, and so was his briefcase full of work documents. This briefcase was believed to contain files and notes from his bank fraud investigations. The car's passenger compartment was too badly burned to yield much else, but the absence of the briefcase and watch spoke volumes. These missing items would soon steer the investigation toward possible motives. The cops initially wanted to write the whole thing off as a robbery gone wrong, but Lee's family pushed back hard against this narrative. Connie Young, Lee's wife, was adamant that a random robbery didn't seem to fit the facts. She pointed out that aside from Lee's personal Rolex, none of the other jewelry or valuables were taken from the car's trunk. The one thing taken from the trunk wasn't cash or gems, but Lee's briefcase of investigative files, an item of importance to Lee's work rather than his personal wealth. This clue was a glaring one. It suggested that whoever was responsible might have been far more interested in what Lee was working on than in what he was carrying. Investigators treated Lee Young's case as a likely foul play situation from the start. There was no evidence that Lee left on his own accord. His bank accounts were untouched, and he had no known reason to disappear voluntarily. The condition and location of the car strongly hinted at criminal involvement, and Scottsdale police officially classified Lee's case as a suspected slaying. With the physical evidence scarce, detectives had to rely on circumstantial clues and Lee's background to hypothesize what happened. Two primary theories emerged and would come to dominate discussions of the case. One initial theory was that Lee Young fell victim to a robbery that spiraled out of control. It wasn't hard to see why this idea surfaced. Lee's lifestyle could make him a target for thieves. He was a well-dressed businessman, often seen wearing an expensive Rolex, and it was well known that he carried large amounts of cash to facilitate on-the-spot jewelry purchases. To an opportunistic criminal, Lee might have seemed like someone carrying a small fortune on any given day. The scenario imagined by this theory is that perhaps, after Lee left the restaurant on May 4th, someone approached him and then robbed him. In this line of thinking, the criminal might have forced Lee to drive out to the desert, taken his valuables, and disposed of his body somewhere in the vast Sonoran desert. However, as investigators dug deeper, the robbery theory started to falter. The crime scene didn't fit the pattern of a typical robbery. The presence of all that jewelry left untouched strongly suggested that theft wasn't the primary motive. It's possible the perpetrator overlooked the jewelry or couldn't find it in the dark trunk, but that seems unlikely given how much wealth was left behind in the open. Additionally, while Lee's fancy Rolex was missing, consistent with a robbery motive, it could also have been removed for other reasons. For instance, it could have been removed to make it look like a robbery, or a hitman could have gotten greedy. The second, far more sinister theory is that Lee Young was targeted because of his investigation into a money laundering operation. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Lee had been zeroing in on irregular transactions at the bank where he worked. He suspected that large amounts of illicit money were being funneled through accounts there, cleaned to appear legitimate, a classic money laundering scheme. Lee's inquiries had pointed toward a Colombian cartel as the source of these funds. He was sufficiently concerned that he alerted federal law enforcement agents who specialized in smuggling and money laundering. He was essentially blowing the whistle on what he believed was a dangerous conspiracy. Federal agents did take his information and were looking into the case. In fact, Lee remained in contact with those agents. About a week before he vanished, he tried to reach out to them again, but was unable to get in touch. This suggests that something he discovered might have alarmed him enough to urgently seek help, or perhaps he sensed he was in danger. Those who support the cartel theory believe that Lee's investigation hit a nerve with very dangerous people. If a cartel was indeed laundering millions through an Arizona bank, an internal investigator like Lee Young would pose a serious threat to their operation. Eliminating him and destroying his evidence could have been seen as the only way to protect their lucrative enterprise. Under this theory, what happened on May 4th, 1990, wasn't a random crime at all, but a planned hit. Lee could have been lured into a meeting under false pretenses, perhaps someone pretending to be a source or client, and then abducted him to silence him. The fact that Lee's briefcase of files disappeared aligns with this scenario. The perpetrators might have seized his documents to find out how much he knew, or to erase the proof of their activities in a pre-digital world. One angle amateur sleuths have speculated on is whether Lee's greatest danger didn't come from outside the bank, but from within. And personally, I prefer this theory, even though I have to admit it's based entirely on circumstantial evidence. As an internal fraud investigator, Lee was probing sensitive transactions and asking questions about accounts that may have been used to funnel cartel money. If he was closing in on proof, it's plausible that someone inside the institution, perhaps a colleague with divided loyalties, saw him as a threat. Banks were not and are not immune to infiltration by bad actors, and organized crime groups often seek insiders who can work with them on their schemes. If such a person existed at Lee's bank, their priority would have been to keep the money flowing and the operation undiscovered. Lee's persistence could have forced their hand. The missing briefcase becomes even more suspicious in this context, since an insider would know exactly what kind of information he carried and why it was dangerous. Rather than a faceless cartel operative striking at random, Lee may have been undone by someone he worked alongside every day. Under this theory, an insider who provided access, arranged the ambush, and ensured his files never reached federal investigators. Further yet, this insider would have been able to use the documents which Lee carried to cross-reference with documentation in the bank as well. Of course, the most sinister theory of all is that the feds were compromised and tipped the cartel off to Lee Young's investigation. I see this as a less likely possibility given that federal agencies are much more difficult to infiltrate than a fairly small bank in Arizona. That said, it's not something that can be dismissed entirely. In the 35 years since Lee Young vanished, his family and friends have had to live without answers. Lee Young's disappearance has continued to remain a chilling Arizona unsolved mystery. The case of missing pilot and smuggler Wallace Thrasher has baffled investigators and true crime enthusiasts for decades because the case is straight up a Hollywood movie plot. And just to be clear right off the bat, this isn't your typical missing persons case. It involves no less than 3 plane crashes. Thrasher was indicted for various trafficking offenses in the mid-1980s, then disappeared under circumstances that remain hotly debated. Despite numerous rumors, including that he died in a plane crash or faked his own death, conclusive evidence of his fate has never been found. Wallace Leon Thrasher was born on April 21, 1946. Little is publicly documented about his youth, but by the late 1970s he was living in southwestern Virginia. Thrasher had a wife and child, and associates described him as charismatic and helpful, if sometimes private. At some point in his adult life, Thrasher took up flying airplanes. Those who knew him said he was a confident pilot who seemed to enjoy the independence and thrill that came with aviation. In the early 1980s, allegations surfaced that Thrasher was using his aviation skills for illegal ends. Rumors swirled in local communities of substance-filled planes landing on clandestine airstrips late at night. While some heard whispers about Thrasher's alleged activities, it was not until the mid-1980s that federal and state officials started to build a formal case against him. Authorities began investigating Thrasher after multiple reports indicated he was involved in smuggling large quantities of weed and coke from South America into the U.S. According to investigators, Thrasher would fly his plane to sites in the Caribbean or Central America, load it with dope, then transport the contraband back into the rural American South. Law enforcement agencies across the country began sharing intelligence on Thrasher. They believed he might have been part of a larger trafficking network, a network that employed local airstrips, remote back roads, and clandestine properties to hide substantial shipments. It was thought that his substances would be transported to major distribution hubs such as Chicago for further processing. This all sounds pretty standard so far, but this is where things are going to go off the rails and get real weird real quick. On October 17th, 1984, a plane flown by one of Thrasher's pilots crashed in Virginia, and 1,200 pounds of weed was discovered. Authorities were able to prove that Thrasher was the owner of the plane, but just as they went to make the arrest, a shocking twist occurred. A newspaper reported that Wallace Thrasher had died in a plane crash in Jamaica. The authorities went to Jamaica and obtained the death certificate, which they determined to be false. They further found no evidence whatsoever of any crash occurring in Jamaica on the date in question. Thrasher's wife later revealed that after October 17, 1984, her husband loaded up $250,000 into a plane for a trip to Belize. She had believed it was one of his standard refill runs to Latin America. Despite authorities issuing an arrest warrant and conducting a significant investigation, no leads came up on Thrasher. In 1986, Thrasher allegedly died in yet another plane crash, this time in Belize. And to prove that Wallace Thrasher really definitely was 100% not living for real this time, a friend of his showed up with his wedding ring recovered from the crash site. Unlike the plane crash in Jamaica, this was actually a real one, and the authorities checked it out, only to discover the extreme severity of the crash. The flames had been so intense that the entire structure of the plane had melted into the ground, calling into question how a pristine wedding ring could have been pulled from the crash site. So I know the theory that the person is still alive can be brought up in relation to every missing person case ever. But I'm just going to come out and say that this one hits different, and in a big way. The questionable plane crash reports, contradictory death certificates, and suspiciously intact wedding ring suggest he orchestrated elaborate deceptions to evade prosecution. And it's important to remember that the authorities had him dead to rights on 1,200 pounds of weed. He was cooked to the point of being well done. Perhaps Thrasher leveraged connections in the smuggling underworld to fabricate a connection to the Belize crash, counting on remote foreign locations and corruption to conceal his tracks. After all, a few well-placed bribes, falsified documents, and planted evidence could enable a wealthy, charismatic pilot to vanish without a trace. Instead of dying in Belize, Thrasher may have slipped into a life under a new identity. With his fortune from smuggling operations, he could have settled somewhere very far from prying eyes that could perhaps only be reached by a landing strip. The dramatic recovery of Thrasher's wedding ring from a fiery crash site reads more like stage theater than hard proof. I think another option needs to be considered as well, though. Wallace Thrasher had accumulated a significant amount of wealth, and there was a ton of heat on him from American authorities. It's always possible that one of his associates had him eliminated, bringing the heat down on their criminal operation, while also allowing the associate to confiscate his illicit earnings. In late 2000, 52-year-old Colleen Wood was preparing to sail around the world with her new boyfriend from the shores of Fort Lauderdale. She had uprooted her life in Ohio to pursue this dream and fallen in love with a charismatic man named John Paul. Paul was a former race car driver turned investor who promised her an exciting life of travel on the open seas. But just as their voyage was set to begin, Colleen vanished without a trace. The adventure of a lifetime had turned into a chilling mystery that remains unsolved till this day. Colleen met John Paul in 1999, and he presented himself as a Harvard-educated businessman and former race car champion. And just to be clear, John Paul was actually a Harvard-educated race car driver who owned his own team, called JLP Racing, back in the 70s and 80s. But as you'll see shortly, his subsequent businesses were much less legitimate. Colleen and John's romance progressed quickly, and by early 2000, the couple planned a 5-year sailing voyage around the globe on John's 55-foot schooner. The boat, originally named the Island Girl, became their home as Colleen quit her job and sold her condominium to join him. She even entrusted John with $43,000 from the sale of her condo to invest for their future together. Colleen was all in on this dream, ready to cast off for a new life at sea. The final confirmed communications from Colleen came in early December 2000, and they gave no hint of trouble. On December 3rd, 2000, she called her son in Ohio to say that she and John would be setting sail in a few weeks and that she'd be in touch again soon. About 10 days later, on December 13th, a friend invited Colleen to a Christmas party. Colleen answered that call from Key West, where she was out enjoying herself with John, and she sounded happy and excited for the journey ahead. She promised her friend she would return to Fort Lauderdale for the party. That was the last anyone heard from Colleen. She never showed up to the holiday gathering she agreed to attend, and more alarmingly, she failed to call her family over Christmas. This was a time she would never miss contacting her 2 grown sons, whom she was extremely close to. By the first week of 2001, her loved ones were deeply concerned. Colleen's cell phone had been disconnected, and all calls went unanswered. It seemed that Colleen had disappeared into thin air. As the search for Colleen began, unsettling facts about John Paul's past came to light. The charming sailor who had swept Colleen off her feet was hiding a history of serious crime. John Paul was a convicted felon who had spent over a decade in prison in the 1980s for activities related to the smuggling of street pharmaceuticals into the United States. However, this didn't even begin to scratch the surface of what John Paul had done. He had once pumped his former associate full of lead, and only through sheer fortune did that man survive. For his crimes, he received 20 years in the slammer and ended up serving most of his sentence. John had only been out on parole for roughly a year when he met Colleen, a fact that wasn't known to her. After all, 5-year boat trips around the world aren't generally compliant with the terms of most people's probation. Disturbingly, Colleen wasn't the first woman close to John to vanish under mysterious circumstances. Back in 1981, John's then-wife had disappeared during a trip to the Florida Keys and was never found. John was considered a suspect in that case, though no charges were filed. This pattern, a woman in John's life vanishing without explanation, cast a dark shadow over Colleen's disappearance. With Colleen missing, the Fort Lauderdale police opened an investigation in early 2001. John Paul initially cooperated when detectives questioned him in May 2001. He claimed that he and Colleen had a fight over money in mid-December 2000, and that Colleen decided to leave him. She had supposedly returned with a couple of tough-looking male friends to grab her belongings before departing for good. John also reportedly told a slightly different story to his own daughter. He told her that Colleen had been upset about some issue involving one of his ex-girlfriends and had broken off the relationship over that. These inconsistent accounts raised eyebrows, and nothing about John's explanations convincingly accounted for why Colleen would drop out of contact completely. Before long, evidence surfaced that made John's stories look even more dubious. Investigators discovered that between mid-December 2000 and February 2001, nearly $40,000 was withdrawn from Colleen's bank accounts. These withdrawals were clearly not made by Colleen, as grainy surveillance images showed other people at the ATMs. Police later identified at least 2 women who had been using Colleen's bank cards during that period. When questioned, those individuals admitted that a man named John had given them Colleen's bank card and PIN, instructing them to pull out cash on his behalf. In other words, John Paul was siphoning off Colleen's money after she vanished, using intermediaries to cover his tracks. Another red flag appeared when detectives found that someone had used Colleen's credit card to place 2 unusual classified ads in a local Florida newspaper in December 2000. One ad was soliciting a first mate for a boat, and the other was a personal ad from a man seeking a female companion. Both ads were paid for with Colleen's card and were placed around the time Colleen went missing. It looked like the person responsible for her disappearance was already trying to recruit a replacement crew member and also find a new love interest. This chilling discovery strongly suggested that Colleen's departure was not voluntary or accidental. As evidence mounted, John Paul didn't stick around. By summer 2001, he had quietly sailed away from Fort Lauderdale on his ship now named the Diamond Girl, violating the terms of his parole in the process and becoming a fugitive. Detectives announced that while John was not officially named a suspect due to lack of physical evidence, they urgently wanted to find and question him again about Colleen's disappearance. Over the following years, there were scattered sightings of John Paul in various exotic locales. Investigators heard reports that he was in the Caribbean. For example, he was rumored to have been seen in Jamaica shortly after fleeing Florida. Later, a passerby in Fiji claimed to recognize him from unsolved mysteries. By 2009, authorities received information that John and his yacht had turned up in Thailand, where he talked about starting a diving business. Not long after, John Paul sold the Diamond Girl in 2011 and disappeared once more, effectively going off the radar. To this day, John Paul has never been apprehended, and now in his early 80s, his exact whereabouts remain unknown. More than 2 decades later, Colleen Wood's fate remains unsolved, but the evidence overwhelmingly points to foul play by John Paul. Without a body or direct proof of a crime, authorities could never charge John for Colleen's disappearance. However, those close to the case believe that John likely eliminated Colleen and disposed of her body, perhaps at sea somewhere near the Florida Keys, where they were last together. The pattern of John draining Colleen's accounts and immediately seeking another companion suggests a calculated crime rather than any sort of accident. On a cool evening in early December 2015, a ranch owner in rural Arizona opened her door to find a polite stranger asking for a place to spend the night. The stranger was Haruchika Miyagi, a successful 34-year-old entrepreneur from Utah, and his unexpected plea for shelter was just the beginning of a baffling mystery. Moments after being turned away, Haruchika sped off in his red Mazda sedan, crashing through a gate as he vanished into the night, and he has never been seen again. Haruchika Miyagi was by all accounts a bright and accomplished individual with a promising life. He was of Japanese descent and sometimes went by the nicknames Haru and Chika. He lived in American Fork, Utah, where he had graduated from Utah Valley University and established himself as an entrepreneur and day trader. Haruchika created his own investment software program called Tensai and was involved with several companies in the finance and tech sector. In addition to his business ventures, he maintained a prolific presence on social media. He posted frequent updates and even uploaded numerous YouTube videos on diverse topics, though most of these were related to finances in some way. The chain of events leading to Haruchika's disappearance unfolded over just a few days in late 2015. On December 3, 2015, Haruchika failed to show up at his workplace, which immediately alarmed his friends and colleagues, That same evening, he posted on Facebook around 9 p.m., marking the last known contact anyone had with him. The post mentioned the importance of giving to others and seems pretty much in line with what Haru would generally be posting to his social media accounts. However, it did mention that he wanted to give as much as possible, which has been interpreted in a more sinister light, given what would happen next. When no one could reach him by the end of the day on December 3rd, a missing person report was filed in American Fork. At that point, Haruchika's sudden absence was already out of character, and while he was a quirky guy, he was good-hearted and always kept in touch with his friends and family. 2 days later, on December 5th, 2015, Haruchika surfaced in a place no one expected, the small community of Dewey, Arizona, over 550 miles away from his Utah home. Dewey is a small and somewhat desolate desert community in northern Arizona. Also, before you leave angry comments about me calling Dewey desolate, I absolutely love isolated communities in the Southwest, to a somewhat weird degree. But anyway, I'm going off script. Let's get back to business. That late afternoon around 5 p.m., a resident on a remote ranch property off Orm Road, near Dewey, called authorities to report a trespasser on her land. The trespasser was Haruchika Miyagi, and after navigating miles of rough dirt roads, he drove up to the woman's house. He politely asked if he could spend the night on her property, though she sensed that something was quite off with him at the time. Unsurprisingly, the homeowner refused and suggested he get a hotel in a nearby town. According to the woman, Haruchika remained calm as he returned to his car. Unfortunately, rather than turning around normally, he sped forward and crashed through a closed gate on his way out. This seemed incredibly odd to her because he had been so calm and composed just moments earlier. About 2 hours later, around 7 that night, deputies found Haruchika's Mazda abandoned in a dry creek bed not far from that ranch. The car had heavy front-end damage and was wedged against a barbed wire fence, but Haruchika was nowhere in sight. The car was towed from the remote spot, and investigators began a thorough search of the surrounding desert and ranch lands. Over the next several days, search and rescue teams combed the area with helicopters and dogs, but they found no trace of Haru. The dogs didn't pick up any scent to follow, and checks of local hospitals turned up nothing. Haruchika's cell phone was never found, and records showed it connected to a cell tower shortly after he left the ranch, then shut off. Haruchika's family in Utah had no explanation for why he would go to Arizona. He had no known contacts or business there. Utah and Arizona police worked together on the case, but as weeks turned into months without any answers, the mystery only deepened. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to him after his car was found, and the events of that December evening remain uncertain. With a case as puzzling as Haruchika Miyagi's disappearance, numerous theories have emerged to explain what might have happened. Investigators and the public alike have carefully considered each scenario, from the mundane to the extraordinary. It's important to note that all of these ideas are speculative. There's no hard evidence yet to confirm any particular outcome. However, examining the most frequently proposed theories can shed light on the possible fate of this good-natured entrepreneur. One leading theory is that Haruchika fell victim to a tragic accident, or perhaps simply just to the elements after fleeing his vehicle. People seriously underestimate the dangers associated with deserts, and it's possible to perish very quickly in these environments. The desert around Dewey can be harsh, especially for someone on foot with no supplies. Without shelter, nighttime temperatures in that region can drop dangerously low, increasing the risk of hypothermia for anyone lost outdoors. If Haruchika became injured or disoriented after crashing his car, he could have wandered off and succumbed to the elements. Authorities did search extensively in the vicinity of the crash, but the terrain is vast and rugged. It is possible that Haruchika's remains were missed during the initial search, or have yet to be discovered, perhaps hidden by brush or washed away by seasonal floods. However, the lack of any tracks or other signs despite search efforts leaves this theory unproven. If he did perish in the wilderness, it would explain the complete silence, but without any discovery, an accident remains only a possible explanation. Another widely discussed possibility is that Haruchika experienced a sudden mental health crisis or psychological break that led him to behave erratically and abandon his life. Those who support this theory note the abrupt, unannounced trip far from home and Haruchika's uncharacteristically odd behavior. Knocking on a stranger's door asking to stay the night and then crashing through a gate are cited as key examples of this. These actions suggest he was confused or distressed. By all accounts, he was normally responsible and stable, so something must have snapped to drive him to act so out of character. Some have speculated that the pressure of his business ventures or personal issues might have been weighing on him, potentially triggering an emotional breakdown. If Haru was in a psychological crisis, it could have led him into danger, or even a failed attempt to voluntarily hide from the troubles in his life. Some observers have even compared Haruchika's situation to other cases where seemingly well-adjusted people suddenly abandoned their lives. This theory is hard to prove without more evidence, but it offers one possible explanation for his otherwise inexplicable actions. This theory is complicated by the fact that there's nothing definitive to suggest that he was in the midst of a breakdown prior to leaving. Thus, the mental breakdown idea is essentially an educated guess based solely on his bizarre final behavior. Nonetheless, the extraordinary nature of his disappearance means investigators cannot rule out that something in his mind went very wrong that weekend. A further variant of this theory suggests that he may have used psychoactive substances. His last Facebook post about giving everything away has been suggested to be potentially driven by the ingestion of such a substance. Ultimately, though, like with the other theories, this is interesting, but there's simply nothing beyond weak circumstantial evidence. Other less likely theories involve foul play or a voluntary disappearance, but these simply have no evidence to support them whatsoever. Nearly a decade later, Haruchika Miyagi's fate remains unknown. Neither his family nor investigators have given up, but with each passing year without answers, it becomes less likely the case will be solved. Personally, I think his case is often discussed because it's so confounding. A man with a stable life ends up far from home, behaves bizarrely, and then vanishes without a trace. All we know for certain is that Haruchika Miyagi is missing, and the circumstances are unexplained, and everything else is open for speculation. Jack Quinn's company car was found abandoned at Palm Beach International Airport on April 9, 1988, and Quinn himself was nowhere to be found. Earlier that day, the security executive had calmly loaded $1.3 million in cash into that car and driven off, only to vanish without a trace. He had pulled off a bold daylight heist and then disappeared into thin air, leaving a mystery that has now endured for nearly 40 years. Jack Quinn was the vice president and general manager of Federal Protection Services, a firm providing armed security for banks and businesses. On the quiet Saturday morning of April 9th, 1988, he arrived at the office as usual, and nothing seemed amiss as he went about his routine. Unbeknownst to everyone, he spent that morning moving that huge sum of cash from the vault into boxes without attracting any suspicion. After packing up the money, Quinn set his getaway in motion. He placed the looted funds into both his personal car and a company vehicle. Then he asked a co-worker, Harry Goldberg, to follow him to his house under the pretense of dropping off his personal car. Goldberg obliged, and at home, Quinn left behind his personal car, with about $100,000 in its trunk, and hastily told his wife goodbye. Harry then drove Quinn back to the office, not realizing he had just helped Quinn execute the first stage of the escape. From there, Quinn slipped into the company car, loaded with the remaining cash, and headed for the airport. At Palm Beach International Airport, Quinn parked the company car at around 5 o'clock that evening and quietly vanished. Investigators later found the abandoned vehicle, but there was no record of Quinn boarding any flight or taking a taxi from the airport. That night, when Quinn failed to come home, his wife grew anxious and called around, but no one knew where he was. By the next morning, she discovered the cash he'd left in their car, along with a letter from Quinn. In the note, he confessed he had done, quote, something wrong, and said he couldn't face the consequences of his actions. His wife, realizing she had been abandoned and not wanting to arouse any suspicion that she was in on it, immediately turned everything over to the police. Quinn's family would soon discover a variety of extremely concerning things about old Jack, and they would learn that he wasn't the man they thought he was at home. Old Jack was living a Burt Reynolds lifestyle on a Mac Davis income, and yes, in case that one was a bit too obscure, that's my Simpsons reference for this video. Wait, scratch that. I'm not limiting myself to just one. There's going to be at least one more in this video, so strap yourself in and feel the G's. As police and federal agents delved into Quinn's background, a significant pattern of deception emerged. This wasn't the first time money had vanished on Quinn's watch, and the company suspected him in prior cash shortages, though nothing was proven. Somehow, despite these issues, he was able to keep his job regardless, which is questionable considering what he did. Even his home life held numerous red flags. For instance, his wife once found a hidden stash of cash in their car, which Quinn essentially explained away by telling her it was just resting there until being returned. Investigators also discovered Quinn had been living very far beyond his means. Despite a modest $35,000 salary, he was renting a 10-acre horse ranch, an extravagant expense that made little sense unless he had an illicit income. He was also in serious financial trouble, owing the IRS a large sum and facing potential jail time for unpaid taxes. As a result of Quinn's crime, his company nearly went under. Federal Protection Services was barely able to stay afloat after losing $1.3 million and eventually had to file for restructuring. Additionally, the $1.3 million he took was in unmarked ordinary bills and was essentially untraceable by authorities. This means that unlike most heist situations like this, he essentially had no trouble using small quantities of cash at any given time. Investigators uncovered another personal angle as well. You've heard the expression, "let's get busy"? Well, this is a dude who gets busy. Quinn was laying pipe consistently and thoroughly. In the month before the theft, he often left home at 5, but didn't arrive at work until hours later, leading police to conclude he was seeing a girlfriend during those early hours. This raised the possibility that he didn't plan to run away alone. He might have intended to start a new life with his mistress. With Quinn gone and few clues to follow, authorities turned to the public for help. In December 1988, Unsolved Mysteries featured the case, prompting a flood of tips from viewers. To put it in context, in the hours after the broadcast, over 1,000 phone calls came in about the case, but only a few provided leads that investigators deemed worth checking. Notably, it's important to remember that the reach of Unsolved Mysteries in the 80s and 90s was astronomical, pulling 10 million viewers an episode in America and Canada combined. People claimed to spot Quinn all over, including a couple of reports of a man in Cozumel, Mexico, with a younger woman, but none of these sightings could be confirmed. Tips came from as far away as Australia, but every lead ultimately turned cold. Finally, in 1992, a significant clue surfaced when the authorities traced Quinn to Houston, Texas, after discovering he had obtained a driver's license there under an alias. The thumbprint on the application matched Quinn, proving he had resurfaced briefly to establish a new identity. Further, he had stolen the identity of a known relative of Quinn, further confirming his identity. Yet by the time agents reached the address on the license, Quinn had already moved on. He had used a rented mailbox in Houston as a drop, then disappeared again, slipping through authorities' fingers once more. After that near miss, Jack Quinn's trail went cold. He remained on the FBI's wanted list, but no confirmed sightings have occurred since the early 1990s. Investigators suspect he may have quietly resettled under another identity, possibly in Hawaii or Maryland, based on scattered hints. Notably, Jack Quinn is fluent in Spanish, and some believe that he made off for Mexico from Texas, but to this day, Jack Quinn's whereabouts remain unknown. Many believe Jack Quinn got exactly what he wanted, a clean getaway and a fresh start. This theory holds that he meticulously planned his escape and is potentially still at large somewhere. He had a huge head start, untraceable cash, and likely false identities prepared. Indeed, the evidence of the Texas driver's license and known aliases supports the idea that he successfully reinvented himself. If alive, Quinn could have quietly integrated into another community under a different name. Over the decades, he may have spent his stolen fortune over the years while keeping a low profile. Others theorize that Quinn's escape may have ended in tragedy or betrayal. Perhaps he fell victim to someone who wanted the stolen money for themselves, or he encountered danger while on the run that led to his demise. At one point, investigators even wondered if Quinn never left Florida at all, suggesting his wife might have been involved in a double cross. Under this theory, his wife eliminated him and then turned over a fragment of the cash to the police to try to frame herself as the good guy. However, this idea was discounted once evidence showed Quinn was alive years later in Houston. Still, it's quite possible that he met with foul play after almost being caught in Houston. Some have theorized that he may have paid some bad hombres to transfer him and the loot south of the border, down Mexico way. Under this theory, in the process of transporting him, the nature of the cargo was found out, and Jack Quinn was eliminated, and the unmarked cash disappeared. Of course, this theory is entirely speculative, though given the amount of illicit traffic between the two countries, it doesn't seem entirely implausible. Almost 40 years later, the disappearance of Jack Quinn remains a compelling financial unsolved mystery. In July 1990, the headless and handless body of 34-year-old Beverly Ann McGowan was discovered on a remote canal bank in southern Florida. Her gruesome fate shocked investigators and the public, not only for its brutality, but for the audacious con artist behind it. In early July 1990, Beverly McGowan placed a classified ad in the Sun Sentinel newspaper seeking a female roommate for her two-bedroom condo. A well-dressed British woman calling herself Alice responded, claiming to be an IBM employee transferred to Fort Lauderdale. Beverly's friends and family recall how quickly Alice charmed her. She spoke with a refined English accent and introduced Beverly to the idea of numerology, which in this case involved using personal numbers to predict one's future. Beverly, eager to bond with her new roommate, provided Alice with personal details like her social security, driver's license, and bank account numbers, supposedly for a numerology chart. And yeah, I can already predict the comments flooding in on this aspect of the case, but I digress. Just days after Alice moved in, Beverly suddenly vanished around July 17, 1990. This abrupt disappearance alarmed her siblings. They visited her condo to find the home in disarray. Beverly's car was missing, her bed unmade with her nightgown laid out, and the phone disconnected. Oddly, her two beloved cats were gone, and personal documents such as her address book, birth certificate, and passport had also disappeared. On July 19th, friends and family received handwritten letters claiming to be from Beverly, claiming she had sold her condo and was starting a new life elsewhere. The tone sounded casual, and the handwriting initially appeared to be hers, which confused investigators because there were no obvious signs she had been forced to write the notes. That same day, however, a fisherman made a grim discovery about 100 miles away. The body of a woman dumped in a canal in St. Lucie County, Florida. The victim's head and hands had been cut off, and a tattoo on her abdomen had been removed, evidently to impede identification. Despite the perpetrator's effort to mask the victim's identity, they overlooked a small flower tattoo on the woman's ankle. Further, the removal of her head had been incomplete to the point that some dental evidence could be collected. Using the tattoo and dental records, police identified the body as Beverly McGowan. Once Beverly's remains were identified, the mysterious roommate Alice became the prime suspect. Detectives quickly surmised that the farewell letters were part of an elaborate deception to delay alarm while the perpetrator fled. Investigators began retracing Beverly's steps and soon uncovered critical evidence that pointed to identity theft and fraud. They learned that someone had been using Beverly's credit cards in the days following her slaying. In fact, a woman matching Alice's description was seen on surveillance using one of McGowan's cards to purchase items and withdraw cash. Police also found Beverly's car abandoned at Miami International Airport. Inside the car, they discovered strands of hair from a wig, suggesting a disguise. This clue proved significant when authorities learned that a person impersonating Beverly had reserved a rental car at London's Heathrow Airport around the same time. According to witnesses, a person described as a man in a woman's wig picked up the rental car using Beverly's name and identification. By now, it was clear the perpetrator had stolen Beverly's identity and left the country. Detectives checked flight manifests out of Miami and discovered that Alice had flown to England on a British Airways flight under the name Sylvia Ann Hodgkinson. This name was familiar to law enforcement, and further investigation revealed it likely belonged to an Englishwoman Alice had befriended in the past. The real Sylvia Hodgkinson has never been found, and authorities suspected she might have been an earlier victim of the same perpetrator. Through this alias, police finally uncovered Alice's apparent true identity: Elaine Parent, an apparently American con artist with a lengthy history of fraud and assumed names. Identifying Elaine Parent was a major breakthrough, but catching her proved to be an enormous challenge. Parent had already fled overseas, and she was a master at vanishing into new personas. In May 1991, Interpol agents actually apprehended Parent in London for carrying a fake passport, where she was found with identification in the names of Hodgkinson and another woman. Astonishingly, due to insufficient evidence tying her to the Florida case at that time, she was released before authorities realized who they truly had in custody. By the time Florida investigators linked forensic evidence from Beverly's car and handwriting in the condo to Parent, their suspect had slipped away again. Elaine Parent then spent the next several years hopscotching around the globe. Reports of sightings came in from all over, ranging from London, Paris, Istanbul, to parts of Australia and South Africa, but each time she managed to stay a step ahead of the law. The case grew cold, but it was never closed. In 1998, in a bizarre twist, the fugitive herself sent police a taunting message. Detectives in Florida received a package containing a photograph of an oil painting, a self-portrait of Elaine Parent. On the back, a note was typed: "Best wishes, your chameleon, referencing her chameleon-like ability to change identities. Also, unfortunately, it looks as though this oil painting has never been released to the public, as I was unable to find a copy of it anywhere online. The breakthrough finally came in April 2002, nearly 12 years after Beverly's slaying. Acting on a fresh tip, police tracked Elaine Parent to an apartment in Panama City, Florida. After evading capture for so long, Parent's luck had run out and law enforcement surrounded her residence. Even in her final moments, the 59-year-old con artist remained dramatic and unyielding. As officers stood outside her bedroom door, giving her a moment to get dressed, Parent decided to take out the trash herself. Elaine Parent died on April 6, 2002, taking with her any secrets about her motives and possible other crimes. So you may be sitting here and asking yourself where the mystery is. Well, earlier on I mentioned that Elaine Parent was apparently her real name and that she was apparently American. Investigators believe that the Elaine Parent identity may have just been another in this criminal's inception-like layers of identities. No birth certificate or other evidence has ever been found to support the existence of Elaine Parent as a real person. No family members or friends have ever been located who knew this individual her whole life to verify her identity. Some investigators believe that her claim to be an American was false, and that she was actually a British or South African woman, pretending to be an American, pretending to be a Brit.